Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I would now like to turn the webinar over to Mr. Stuart Salters. Sir, you may begin.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's API RP 1175 Implementation Team Fall Webinar. We have some exciting stuff to share with you this morning, and we appreciate everybody's time. I have the webinar open, so hopefully folks on the line are able to call in as well as log in, so you can both hear and see the slides, hear us speak and then see the slides. So if either of those options aren't working, then look back at the calendar invite and you'll find a little bit more detail to get logged in. Don't want to take up too much of your time because there's a lot of stuff, exciting stuff that the implementation team wants to share, but just very quickly, you'll see the agenda on the slide now. So a lot of things to talk about, but before we jump into that, I wanted to do the API antitrust, just recognizing there are several operators represented on the phone, several companies represented on the phone, so just let's be aware of these guidelines as we have the discussion this morning. So you'll listen as I read these. It's API's policy to comply with the antitrust laws. API staff and member company representatives should observe the following guidance. No discussing or forecasting of prices for goods or services provided by or received by a company. No sharing or discussing any company's confidential or proprietary information. No discussion of any company's specific purchasing plans, merger, divestment plans, production information, inventories, or costs. No sharing or discussion of specific company compliance costs unless publicly available. No agreement or discussion regarding the purchase or sale of goods or services. Such decisions are independent company decisions. No discussion of how individual companies intend to respond to potential market, economic scenarios, or government action. Discussion should be limited to generalities, and then no disparaging remarks regarding specific vendors, products, or services. If you do believe there is an antitrust concern during the discussion, please reach out to API's General Counsel or to your company's on counsel to raise that concern. With that being said, I'll turn the presentation over to Jason Dalton, who's going to share with us a little bit about a lesson they learned on slack lines. Jason?
Thanks, Stuart. As Stuart mentioned, my name is Jason Dalton. I'm the Hydraulics and Leak Detection Supervisor for Marathon Pipeline, and would like to take some time this morning to talk about slack lines and their impact on operations and leak detection. Next slide, please, Stuart. So what we're going to talk about is some of the physics of slack lines, why slack lines are a risk that increase the risk of operating pipelines, and some lessons learned regarding slack lines. Next slide, please. So first of all, what is a slack line? Slack line is basically where the pressure inside the pipeline has dropped below the pressure required to keep a liquid in a liquid state. So instead, it boils off and forms vapor pockets. In this line, you can see a typical hydraulic gradient for a simple pump station, one pump station to a delivery station with a hill located near the end. Stuart, go ahead and click so the animation comes up. So in a slack line, there's a vapor pocket located at the high point, and you get open channel flow through that high point, and it can create issues with your leak detection system. The display you're seeing right here is what you would see if you actually saw in the pipe at that high point. The top has vaporized hydrocarbon and the bottom is still liquid. And this can happen when you shut the line down or while the line's flowing. So next slide, please, Stuart. So there's two chief risks of slack lines. One, it can impede and potentially blind internal monitoring and leak detection systems. And two, when you have a slack line, you could potentially create abnormal conditions that could result in a system overpressure. These are the two things we'll talk about for the rest of this presentation. Stuart, next slide, please. So the main risk of a leak or a slack line is it can change the perception of what the line is actually doing. So in this case, if the line was tight, so you had positive pressure at all points and you lose 4 psi, that means that some of the fluid in the line is decompressing and you're going to lose approximately 2 barrels per 4 psi. However, if the line is slack and you lose 4 psi. Looking at this elevation profile, you could potentially lose up to 200 barrels. So the risk is that if you're used to running in a tight line situation and the operating center is typically used to seeing just a couple psi and that's no big deal, but then you go into a slack line and you lose just a few psi, you could have a significant release volume. So this is something that we look at is, where are you on your elevation profile? What kind of release could result from a change in pressure? Next slide, please. So the leak detection risks, you have a blindness from a potential leak. So when a system is restarted and it's slack, you have to repack that vapor space. So you turn the pump on and your receipt meter can be spinning and your delivery meter isn't. And you have to ask yourself while you're adding fluid to the system, am I pushing product through a hole out into the environment or am I repacking the system? And you don't necessarily know unless you've really studied the slackline event. In addition, if you've got a vapor pocket, it can really interfere with real-time transient modeling because the wave speed is modified and you've got multiple densities in the line. So again, your two main risks, while you're down, your pressure monitor is impeded, you don't have good eyes on the pipeline, and if you're running while you've got a slackline condition, your performance isn't near the best that you can get. Next slide, please. So the 3 keys are to study the system. One of the terms is pattern recognition. You want to study the patterns that the line takes when it goes slack and look to see if it's going slack in a way you haven't seen before. Is it going slack extremely quickly? Is the pressure dropping at a different rate? Is one section going slack that you don't expect to see normally? The second is to know the system. So once it's slack, know what you should expect to see. If you've got a pressure transmitter that the entire time you've been watching that pressure transmitter, the lowest pressure you've ever seen is 50 psi, and now you're seeing 20 psi, you probably have a problem, and that warrants further investigation. And the last step is to reduce your exposure time. Repressuring the line as soon as possible decreases the amount of time when you're operating essentially blind. Those are the 3 keys that we try to use to minimize these risks. Next slide, please, Stuart. So the last issue is there are pressure control risks. So when you've got a slack line and you've got that vapor pocket, if you've got a short line, you're going to turn the mainline units on and you'll get a very high flow rate while it repacks the line. But then that flow rate's going to stop. So you start a short line, you turn the pumps on, they're going to take off and push a very high flow rate. And eventually that's going to stop. When that vapor bubble, when the vapor that's in the line recondenses back to liquid, you're going to get an instantaneous change in velocity in the line. Well, all the energy has to go somewhere, and that energy is going to change from flowing energy into pressure. And what you're seeing on this chart is pressure spikes. So we started a line, it was very short, the high point was right outside of the station, and the system recondensed. There was an instantaneous stoppage of flow, and we got a pressure spike to come back. So one of the things that needs to be done is if you're going to start doing these repressure plans, you're going to need to study it and make sure that you've got a good transient analysis done to make sure that you understand all of the surges that are going to happen. Once that's done, you don't need to do it again, but it should be something that you should do before you just decide that you're going to repressure everything. Next slide, please. So the chief lessons learned is you should do, if the line has never gone slack before, don't just turn the pumps on. Do a transient study, take a look at what you got before you restart. Then the next one is adequately know the role of the transients, even on short lines. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Doug Sauer to go over API 1175's purpose and goals. Thank you.
Jason, as he said, my name is Doug Sauer, and I just wanted to review the purpose of this recommended practice 1175, which is program management for leak detection, and also want to touch on our goals as an implementation team. Next slide, Stuart. So some of you may be new to this recommended practice, so I'll give you an overview of it. For others, this may just be a refresher. But to the question, what is API 1175? Its purpose came from a PHMSA request a few years ago after they had evaluated or investigated industry accidents, and they felt like our industry really needed to step up our leak detection capabilities. And so they challenged the industry to improve upon this, and so API brought together a team of operators and developed a new recommended practice for managing leak detection programs. And this RP 1175 is the result of that. It consists of non-technical recommendations for managing a holistic leak detection program. So this isn't your scientific or your technical guide of how to put in CPM systems. There's other RPs that address that. This is to look at leak detection as an entire program for an operator, not just in the control center, but across all of your capabilities and operations. There's 11 elements to the recommended practice. These are those 11: leak detection culture and strategy, leak detection methods. We get into targets, KPIs, metrics, deals with testing, control center procedures, alarm management. As you can see on the screen, roles and responsibilities. And then there's the reliability-centered maintenance. So it's important to not just have leak detection systems and tools, but having a robust maintenance program around that. And then managing change, and then periodically doing a performance evaluation of your program and having solid processes to drive improvements. So that's a summary of the RP. Next slide. I want to take you on our journey of what we've been doing since this recommended practice was established. A group of operators in industry developed this recommended practice over the years 2014 and 2015 and published it in December 2015. Then there was API, and the Pipeline Executive Steering Team formed a new committee to really help promote the implementation of this recommended practice. That took place last year, and that team is still in place and is organizing this webinar today. So last year, shortly after being formed, we developed a gap assessment tool to help the industry do a baseline assessment of where their programs and performance is versus the new recommended practice. We conducted a webinar in late 2016 to sort of debut that gap assessment tool, and then got all the results of those when operators submitted the summary of their results back into API. We hosted early this year, we hosted a leak detection workshop in conjunction with the annual Pipeline Conference, and shared the results of that baseline survey, or that baseline assessment. And based on the results of the baseline, we have been focusing on the sort of the weakest areas, or the elements that had the most gaps. And that was also some of the feedback that we received from participants in the workshop in the spring. And so we've developed some tools or templates to help industry on a few of those, and we'll share those today here on the webinar. And then going forward, we plan to conduct a second follow-up gap assessment in the first quarter of 2018, and that will help us measure progress that the industry has made from baseline assessment to 1 year later second assessment. And we'll plan to share the results of that at the next pipeline conference in April 2018. We also are going to have a leak detection session at the Cybernetics Symposium that will also be there in St. Louis after the annual pipeline conference. Okay. So we have identified some performance metrics that we'll use to measure progress on this, and I'll share what those look like. Some of these are sort of qualitative or softer, and that is the gap assessments that I just talked about. From our baseline assessment, we had 37% of the API and AOPL members submit their confidential results, and that represented roughly 95% of the barrel miles in our industry. So I feel like we had a really good response with that baseline. And as we do the next one in first quarter of 2018, we hope to see even more operators get engaged in that and participate. We also are measuring participation in webinars and workshops. And so, for example, we had 106 registrants at our first webinar. We had 170 registrants at the April workshop in San Antonio. And then the third measure is really the ultimate measure that our external stakeholders will expect to see us improve on, and that is what's the leak size, the average leak size when the industry does have spills, and we'll look at that, or the trends with different commodities, crude systems, refined product systems, and HVL systems. And that's a longer term measure, but that'll really help see whether the industry has made improvements or not in terms of being able to detect leaks and respond to those. So all that really fits in with our implementation team's goal, which is to encourage operators to embrace this RP. We want to accelerate the deployment of all of the contents of the 1175 and really ultimately to minimize consequences from spills. Quicker detection, quicker shutdown, smaller releases. This is our implementation team, just in case you're curious who's on the team. There's 7 operating companies that are participating on this particular team, and they're listed here. So I won't go through those, but you have that in your slide. But we do have 7 operating companies, and I appreciate everybody's contributions on the team. I think we've got a really good dynamic going with the team, and a lot of hard work's been done. Our last slide. Okay, so I mentioned that we had done a gap assessment, and we are looking at the elements that scored the lowest, if you will, or the areas of least progress or largest gaps, however you wish to look at that. And so there's 4 of those that really stood out to us. The leak detection culture and strategy, performance targets, metrics, KPIs, and being able to do an overall performance evaluation and processes for improvement. So we're featuring 2 of those today, and that is culture and strategy, and then also performance targets. So you'll hear a little bit more about those next. And so I'd like to turn it over now to Rick Bishop from Buckeye to talk about the strategy template.
Thank you, Doug. Pleasure to be here and share some of what the team has done and trying to help the industry move forward on this. Next slide, please. As Doug mentioned, the industry has expressed an interest in developing a strategy document, something to help give them a leg up, someplace to get started, someplace to make it a little easier, to help jumpstart the development. And this team has put together a strategy document that should be able to help with that. And we're presenting it here for your consideration and use. And there's a link in the slide where you can get to it, but at the end of the presentation, Stuart will explain to you more about where you can get it. Next page. The document's organized largely along the lines of the recommended practice in section 5.2. It was written using Microsoft Word. We think it's something that's relatively available for everyone to use, so it was individually and generally easy to modify and usable. Again, the intention is we're providing a draft with a lot of reminders to fill in specific information related to you so that you can make this your document. It's not necessarily supposed to be ours. It's supposed to be something to help you get there, but it's your document at the end of the day. We also suggest, rather than writing everything that you possibly know about your leak detection program in here, you might have other documents, other places in your files or systems. Just provide links in there so you can get to them and find them. Again, it's supposed to be your document, not ours. Also, we've included a lot of task tables throughout to kind of reinforce the responsibility and accountability that fits within your organization so that you get to define, okay, these are the things we need to do. These are the people that we have to do that, and when are they supposed to be done? Next slide. Doug has read through these headings once already, so we're not going to do that again per se, but I would like to take a minute to just review each section and just generally what it's about, a little more specific. In management commitment, it's really around a management statement committing to provide the required resources as defined, and also periodic reviews to make sure that it's on track with what their expectations are. The next section is strategy, goals, and requirements. Again, to kind of reduce the number, frequency, and volume of releases, and improve timeliness of recognition and response is generally where that's headed. Just kind of, it gives you a chance to lay out, this is what we plan to do. It highlights that this is supposed to be a risk management approach. It doesn't mean you have to do everything all at once. It does suggest and recommend that you apply your resources in a priority order, addressing and minimizing the highest risks first is what this is recommending. But you get to decide the timing and so forth, at least until the regulations change and require something else. Selected leak detection methods is a place that provides for you where you can put identifying the various methods that you plan to use in your company, including which one is your primary if you have such a designation. If you have weak areas in that primary resource, like for example, CPM is a good system, but maybe it doesn't pick up really small leaks that well. So you may need something else as a secondary method, or maybe some alternate or complementary systems or processes that will help you get the answers you need in a timely fashion. At least it's giving you the ability in that place to think it through and document what you plan to do. Regulatory requirements and standard is quite honestly a list of applicable regulations and recommended practices that are available, largely copied right out of the RP, but it's there for reference for you to make it easy. Under the section for testing leak detection systems, leak detection KPIs, and evaluating the leak detection program. With any system, you're going to need to test it periodically to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. As part of that, it's usually helpful to put out key performance indicators. Okay, you've made a test. What did it tell you? Is it good or bad? Is it meeting your expectations or not? You have to kind of define that during the process of things and find out how you're doing. And then you want to periodically evaluate your overall program and say, is it working? But we'll refer to that more coming up on the next presentation. The leak detection system tuning and support is a section that it's following the testing. It's making adjustments to make sure that the system is working as optimally as possible. So you found that the system is working, but maybe you could tighten up the thresholds a little bit and give you a little quicker response on some of your marginal indications. Then there's a section for leak detection reporting. And again, this is a place where you decide for your company how you're going to report on the progress or even the status of your leak detection program. You've done testing, you've done evaluations, you probably ought to tell somebody in your company they're going to be interested. But also there's a reference in there, as Doug had mentioned earlier, to report back and tell us, not the team necessarily, but API, work through them to let them know how you're doing so that we can capture these benchmarks and assess the industry progress. But there'll be more on that later as far as where you can file your report, what kind of information we're looking for, and how we keep it confidential so it's not going anywhere else. In the next section, we're talking about procedures and training. In this area, you just figure out what procedures you need. I mean, most things that we do, we have to have a procedure for. And if you have a procedure, you probably need to arrange the training for that, depending on what level, whether it's a management worker or an operations worker, what level of training that they need to do it well. The next section is just a summary of management of change. It's just a process for managing any changes that you feel you need to make in your company. And it's largely around communication and documentation, making sure everybody that needs to know knows in a timely fashion, and you can show that everyone that needed to know was told and informed and part of the process. The next section is about ongoing improvement, and as recommended in the practice, this is a longer term, a bigger picture review and update, not just looking at the specifics of a given system, but looking at the overall program, and is your program effective? And if not, taking the opportunity to update it and correct it. The next one is a place for the executive sign-off or management sign-off, just to make sure that, you know, they've said, okay, I agree with this, we're going to do this, we're behind you. Then at the end, we've included some places, some appendices for specific information that's specifically related to your system. A lot of times you need to know, okay, this is my program, but what exactly are we talking about? And this gives you a place to put down, okay, what specific assets am I talking about? Maybe this one's handled differently than that one for some reason. A place to identify your risks, maybe put your risk ranking in here, or a link to a risk rank you've done in another part of your company. A place listing some of your constraints, or even other technologies that you've looked at that you're not quite ready for, or that you'd like to use when they become fully ready. Next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of kind of the heading of the document, so you kind of have an idea of what you're looking at when you actually go look it up and see it. Again, it starts with an introduction. The writing that's in red typically means it's information. It's a reminder that you need to probably do something. But I would suggest that when you write yours, you take that out of there. There are other places in there too. For example, in the first paragraph, it talks about company name. Again, this is supposed to be for your company. It's not for everybody else. Next slide, please. On this slide, again, it's just a copy of the strategy and goals section. But the highlight here is we're looking at the responsibility table. Most of them are blank. We filled this one out to kind of give you an idea of exactly what we were intending, or how you might use the tool for yourself. So what's responsible? Is it the control center manager? Is it the leak detection program manager? What tasks are they supposed to fulfill, and what is the due date on that? It's a way for you to establish and maintain some accountability as you go through the program. Next slide, please. And this was just a snapshot of the procedures and training area, just to show kind of what the role and content of training table might look like, just to give you some familiarity of what the document looks like as you work through it. This certainly isn't the entire document. These are just some snapshots to give you an idea of how it might work. And now I'd like to turn it over to Donnie to talk some more about metrics, KPIs, and targets.
Thank you, Rick. So performance targets, metrics, and KPIs was an area we saw a need for more detail and clarity. And that was, as Doug mentioned earlier, that was after looking at the results from the workshop surveys and the gap assessments. So that's what these next few slides are going to be about. Next slide. So the first thing I'd like to do is to define the terms and their relationships with each other. So for metrics, it defines the overarching qualities desired from the leak detection system. You can think of those as categorical type terms. And then you have KPIs, which are the specific measures of the metric. And then you have performance targets, which are the values you use to measure the KPIs and determine if the metric goals are being achieved. So when you tie these three terms together, as you see below, for example, we can have a metric which is accuracy. Well, how are we going to measure accuracy? We're going to use a KPI, and we'll use leak location. And to determine how well we're doing with leak location accuracy, we would have a acceptable performance target, which in this case would be plus or minus 5 miles of where a leak would be located. Next, please. So on this slide, 1175 discusses 4 metrics, and they are accuracy, reliability, robustness, and sensitivity. So these 4 metrics can be used for help to measuring leak detection systems. That's not all inclusive, but these are the ones that 1175 describes. And so for accuracy, you can see you're answering the question here as how good are the size and location estimates. In terms of reliability, you're trying to answer the question, can you depend on the leak detection system and alarms for that particular LDS? In terms of robustness, you're looking at, will it work in a less than perfect environment, to see how good your robustness is. And then sensitivity, question you're answering is how small a leak can you detect. So these are 4, and we do, if you see in the bullet above, there's an asterisk by 1175, which refers to a footnote down below, and it's to let you know that if you want more details other than what 1175 has related to these metrics, you can look at the RP 1130. It has more information about these particular metrics. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, go back, I'm sorry. This last bullet here, metrics should be included with each leak detection system. That's an important item. This includes CPM as well as non-CPM leak detection systems. And so I wanted to make that statement. And to look at all leak detection systems that can be available, there's a wide range of leak detection techniques that appear in Section 6.5 in Table 2. And they range from externally based versus internally based systems and continuous versus non-continuous systems. So that's an important note I wanted to bring there. So, next slide. So here are some examples of some metric KPI and performance targets. So for a metric, you could have accuracy, and you could measure accuracy by using a KPI leak flow rate. And you can have an acceptable performance target of plus or minus some barrel amount an hour. For reliability, you could measure false alarms. And for that KPI for false alarms, you may have a count so many false alarms per month, or per week, or per year, however you would see fit for your pipeline operations for that leak detection system. In terms of robustness, one KPI could be measuring the amount of time critical pipeline instrumentation is unavailable. And so if some of the instrumentation or critical instrumentation is not available, your system may still be able to operate, but it's not operating at an optimal level or performance, and so you would want to track that time, and again, per month or week or year, however you see fit, just to measure the degradation of the system, again, that it's not operating at optimal levels throughout the entire operation. And then for sensitivity, the sensitivity metric, you can have a KPI of smallest detectable leak rate, and you'd have some barrel an hour number that you would be deemed acceptable performance for that particular leak detection system. Next slide. So these are 2 more examples. The only difference here is that you'll see I have leak detection systems inserted on the left side. So this first example, and particularly, we're dealing with a leak detection system that is a real-time line balance system. And so you would have a metric, a reliability metric for that system, and you're measuring false alarms, which is your KPI. And again, you'd have a performance target of so many false alarms per month. In addition to that, you could also employ another leak detection system that would be acoustic pigs. And you could be measuring accuracy as your metric for acoustic pigs, and your KPI would be the leak location. And you would have some targeted performance target, plus or minus so many feet, of where you would think a leak location would be identified or occur. So depending on which leak detection systems you use will determine which metrics, KPIs, and performance targets you track for that leak detection system. Next slide, please. So this slide is I'm trying to summarize what we've covered so far, and it's relating to the metrics, KPIs, and performance targets of a leak detection system. So we haven't talked about leak detection program yet. This is still a leak detection system. So in the bottom left side, the bottom left corner, you would have an example here of a pipeline. I called it pipeline number 1. It could also be pipeline segment number 1, depending on how you decide to separate your pipeline operations in your systems. But for pipeline number 1, you would have a primary leak detection system for that pipeline, and it would have its own metrics, KPIs, and performance targets. Then, if applicable, you would have a complementary leak detection system, and it would have its own metrics, KPIs, and performance targets. And so those systems are related to that particular pipeline or that segment. And then you would move over to pipeline number 2, and it would be the same idea. You would have a primary leak detection system identified for that pipeline, pipeline number 2 or segment number 2, with its metrics, KPIs, and performance targets, and the same thing with the complementary leak detection system. And that would continue on throughout all the different pipelines you have in your pipeline operations, or as many segments you have that you decide you need to divvy up those systems. And so all of those contribute to the leak detection program, and that's what we'll transition to. Next slide. So each one of these pipelines and their leak detection systems with their metrics and KPIs and performance targets, which are in blue, all contribute information to what's in red, what you see above. And those KPIs and performance targets, that's one set. It's not a set for each one of the systems you have below. And it's one set relating to the leak detection program. And so information from each one of those leak detection systems in blue contribute information to what's in the leak detection program in red. So how do you measure, or what are the leak detection program KPIs measuring? And that's on the next slide. So these KPIs are measuring the leak detection program effectiveness. So how do you measure effectiveness? Well, what's described in 1175 is, it's how well the people, processes, and leak detection systems are functioning holistically to achieve the overall objectives that were approved in the leak detection strategy. So as I stated before, they're not the same KPIs that are used for the individual systems. So the individual systems provide information to help you measure the KPIs that are in the leak detection program set. And the last bullet, a leak detection program performance report should be delivered to management on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So how do we measure? How do we measure the leak detection program KPIs? You can see in section 13.6, figure 3, in 1175, they have this pyramid, and this pyramid shows you that KPIs are divided up into 4 different levels. And so level 1 and level 2 are lagging indicators, and level 3 and level 4 are leading indicators. And so your KPIs that are described in the section should be identified or show up in one of these levels. So level 1 shows are used to, those KPIs are used when you have a major event or a real significant event, and you can use your decision point as an event that would have to be reported to PHMSA as a decision point for a level 1 indicator. An example of a level 1 indicator would be barrels per leak, where continuous leak detection systems were designed to identify the leak. At a level 2 is very similar or extremely similar to level 1. You're just tracking the incidents or events that are not as major as a level 1 would be. And so, for instance, they may not, level 2s may not be need to be reported to PHMSA, but there are significant that you need to track them. And the same KPIs that are described for Table 6 for level 1s are described in Table 7 for level 2s. For level 3s, an example of a level 3 indicator, which is a leading indicator, could be the number of tests conducted on leak detection systems in a given year. So, again, it's not individual systems, but it's holistically all of the systems. And you can see more examples of level 3s in Table 8 in the RP. And then for level 4, an example of a level 4 would be the average time to correct an instrument malfunction that impacts an operational leak detection system. So, again, more examples about or relating to level 4 leading indicators could be shown or could be seen in Table 9. So in summary, just wrapping up these slides, for leak detection systems, there should be a set of metrics, KPIs, and performance targets for each one being utilized, each leak detection system being utilized. And for a leak detection program, you should have one set of metrics, or KPIs rather, one set of KPIs and performance targets that are categorized into these various levels as you see here on the slide. So that was it. I will turn it over to Rick Barlow for a Q&A.
Great. Hi, Donnie. Thank you, Donnie. This is Rick Barlow with the Leak Detection Department at Enbridge Pipelines. I just want to thank everybody that joined in. I know we had an avalanche of people at the last minute dialing in, so hopefully everybody's on the line can hear us now and can see the presentation. And as already been mentioned, the presentation will be available. It's being recorded, and also the presentation will be available to everybody that's dialed in. And the first thing I'd like to do is just to thank Doug, Rick Bishop, and Donnie for covering the key topics of this webinar. We now have a chance to answer any questions that may have come up. We'll check with the audience shortly, but first I'd like to start things off with a general implementation question. And my question is to implementation team member Robert Morgan from Chevron Pipelines. Robert, API 1175 is very comprehensive, and maybe my company doesn't have all the resources to tackle it all at once. Where should we start first?
Hi, Rick. I think from a Chevron Pipelines perspective, we feel like the best place to start is the long-term strategy. The leak detection strategy is going to help guide you through the process of figuring out which department or which part of your organization would work on each of the various elements. And I think that really gives you a good start. Coupled with that, if you also will do the gap assessment, it kind of gives you an indication what you're already doing well and what may need more work. So that's how we would start.
Great. Thank you, Robert, for getting us started. And just as a reminder, Rick Bishop in his presentation pointed out that to get you started, there is a strategy document template that operators can download and adjust to meet their needs. So now I'll ask Sabrina, our operator, to open up the lines for any questions. So are there any questions from the audience? And please press 1 to answer a question through the operator.
Thank you. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question at this time, please press star and then 1 on your touch-tone telephone. If your question has been answered or you wish to remove yourself from the queue, please press the pound key. Again, that is star and then 1 to ask a question.
Hi, Sabrina. Have you seen any hands going up yet?
Thank you. And the first question will come from the line of Sarah Harris with ONOK. Your line is now open.
Thank you. Sarah Harris with ONOK here. I'm just curious if there's any anticipation of when API 1175 will be incorporated by reference to DOT 195?
Maybe that would be a question for Stuart Salters from API.
Yeah, Yes, no, thanks, Rick, and good question, Sarah. So, don't want to get into the weeds here. As my job as policy advisor for API, I could talk for days on end about regulations and what things are like in Washington. But just kind of in summary, as the new administration has come into office, there's been a lot of executive orders. You may have heard some of them nicknamed 2-for-1, net neutral. So a lot of requirements, a lot of restrictions basically on any executive branch agency with regards to new regulations. So there's a lot of things that need to be met before any new regulation will come into effect, including incorporating by reference any standard. So any new regulation can't have any cost to the industry without removing cost from current regulation. 2-for-1 is basically 2 regulations have to be removed for every one that's put into place. So, kind of the short answer to your question is not anytime soon, just because of all those restrictions that are in place. And so I think while the industry sees some benefit in having 1175 incorporated by reference, there's still some stuff that may need to be worked through with the document. And so I think it may be good that there is this little lull here in having before it has incorporated by reference. But I think, with that being said, at least from my perspective, and maybe you folks in the industry, if you're engaged with the auditors, with the regulators, there's a lot of interest in this. And so, as Doug mentioned earlier, to have 95% of all industry barrel miles responding to the gap assessment, to have all of you folks on the call today, I think it's a positive step, and PHMSA's happy to see that industry is embracing this new guidance. And so probably a lot more than you wanted to hear, but I think, like I said, short answer, we don't see it be incorporated anytime soon, but they are keeping a close eye.
Great. Thank you, Stuart. Again, to our operator, Sabrina, are there any other questions that you have now?
Thank you. And the next question will come from the line of Sina Fardisi with All Plains American. Your line is now open.
Yes, I would like to know if we are going to get any feedback about the results that have already been submitted to the committee in terms of the gap analysis. So what was the industry norms? Where were the gaps in the industry? What was the average score in details as different companies submitted to the committee?
Yeah, maybe we'll give that back to Doug, because it was on his slide. Do you want to speak to that, Doug?
Yeah, sure, I can take that one. So, yeah, good question. I kind of glossed over that in my earlier presentation, but one of the slides in the slide package that will be available for you is titled 2017 Gap Assessment Results, and you should be able to see that now. I think Stuart's pulled that back up. But those
yes, I did see that. Yeah, but we would like to see details, all the details as we submitted in the spreadsheet. Different aspects by detail.
Yeah. So what API has made available is this level of detail. We don't have specific details from each operator that were submitted. What we have is a sort of an aggregate score across all of the operators that submitted their results, and this is measured on sort of a scale of 1 to 100. With 1 means bullseye, everything's being done, and the farther you are from 1 means there's more gaps. So it's a little bit of the inverse of what you might have thought about in terms of a score when we were all in school. 100 is not good on this scoring mechanism. 1 is good. So hopefully that helps, but there's not any specific question by question results made available. Part of that's because the API wants to protect the confidentiality of all the submitters, and so they've aggregated it this way just by looking at a total score, an average or median score by element.
Thank you so much. And my feedback is that I think we're not looking for company-specific details, but the average scores and detail will be will be helpful. You know, we can use them.
Okay. Yeah, appreciate your questions and comments there.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Yeah, good question. Maybe Sabrina, do we have another question?
Thank you. And the next question will come from the line of Nikos Salmiwania with Chevron. Your line is now open.
Hi. Actually, I'm here with Nikos. This is Wendy Asali from Chevron Pipeline. I have a question. Okay, first, let me understand. You said that you have to have two sets of KPIs. One for your leak detection system, one for the program, yes? And for the leak detection system, you have to have KPIs for every leak detection system per pipeline. Is that correct?
I think, Donnie, do you want to take that one?
Yes, Rick, I'll take this one. Yes, you are correct. You do need to have metrics and KPIs for each system because you need to track or measure the performance of that system. But then at the leak detection program level, you're not really measuring a leak detection system. You're measuring, again, the effectiveness, and you'll have these slides with you afterwards, but the effectiveness is how the people and the processes, or how are they all working holistically to have an effective leak detection program. But at the leak detection program level, you should have one set of KPIs and performance targets. Now, certainly if you have two leak detection programs, you would have a set for each one, but certainly one for each leak detection program.
Okay. So the question then is, so have you done any work on setting those targets, especially for the leak detection system, so we can compare and benchmark our values with the, recommended practice?
No, those have not been set yet. I think that's one of the items moving forward with implementing 1175 as an industry is if there's some benchmarking that could be done at the industry level. What I think will be difficult is that each pipeline has its own characteristics as far as hydraulics and those things. So that's something that's going to need to be looked at in the future, but as of now, there's no benchmarking set that we could use other than what's available in 1175, but you can tweak those as you see fit for your system.
Thank you. And I have one more, but that is for the first presenter. I joined a little late, so I don't know the name of the person that was presenting on the Slack. Is this okay to ask this now, or should I wait till we finish with the gap analysis, with the, gap analysis?
No, you go ahead and ask. You can ask Jason now. Jason did the presentation. Jason, you still on the line?
I'm still here.
Hi, Jason, what is your last name again?
Dalton?
Okay. Can you explain a little more? You talk about pattern recognition. So have you done work on that, and how are you using for that? Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Yeah. So pattern recognition would be where we would like to go. We're at the very rudimentary beginning of it now. So when a line goes slack, we've recorded several CPM trends and basically pressure instrumentation telemetry. And as the line goes slack, we'll compare the real-time data that we're seeing as it's created with what we saw on the past several slack line situations. And we can kind of look at it and say, okay, this slack line, we've got a ground temperature of 60 degrees, it's this type of crude oil, and it's noon. So let's go find the last time that we had these same setups. And we can look at that trend versus what's happening, and if we see a significant deviation, we'll know that we might need to really start looking into it.
Okay.
But it's important to model events that are like you don't want to look at a summer shutdown in the winter to justify whether or not you've got an okay line.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Great, thanks for those questions. Yeah, Rick Barlow here. Actually, I'm going to follow up on something that the previous questioner just had. It will be another question for our implementation team, and this one will be for Marielle Romero from TransCanada Pipelines, and it follows up to that. Marielle, API 1175 talks a lot about metrics and associated KPIs, like our last discussion the questioner had. From your point of view, what are the most important KPIs to track, and why are they important? Marielle?
Hi, Rick. How are you?
Oh,
yeah, so Marielle Romero here from TransCanada. I believe that we started. I don't think there are any KPIs that are more important than others. I can share how we started here. We started with the leak detection specific ones, so the ones named in the RP, like reliability, sensitivity, accuracy, and also availability. And then we also expanded it to other KPIs that will tell us if our leak detection system is detecting prior to, like if we are detecting any issues prior to introducing to production. So if that's if you develop your leak detection system in-house, or you're part of the project system within your company. And we're also moving into now talking to the other layers of, okay, how air patrols are going to be measuring their effectiveness, how the other layers in our leak detection system, our leak detection program, are measuring their effectiveness to have the overall leak detection system efficiency.
Great, thanks, Marielle. And yeah, I know metrics is a tricky topic, and again, just to mention, Donnie in this presentation did have his pyramid, where he does show the different some examples of leading and lagging metrics and overall industry metrics. Well, our gap assessment itself is an overall industry performance metric that we're working on, so we're getting there. Maybe we'll go back to the audience to see, Sabrina, are there any more questions from the audience?
Thank you. And the next question will come from the line of Carlo Aptio with Williams. Your line is now open.
Yeah, so my question is regards again to the performance targets for the overall leak detection program management document. I guess, could you give some clarification on some of the items that we can quantify or identify as key performance numbers for the whole program? Because I'm having a hard time. You know, I understand the performance targets for each pipeline, but as far as trying to have something quantifiable on the holistic side, it's a little bit unclear on how we should move forward on that respect.
I'm not sure if anybody on the team wants to mention. I know that the overall performance is a challenge for a lot of people, and if you look in API 1175, I believe there's a table that gives some examples of overall program metrics that you could be looking at, among other things. I mean, how many times you're testing your system, how many times you may be adjusting your thresholds, what % of line have you covered with your system, things like that. But anybody on the team want to make any more comments?
Yeah, Rick, this is Donnie. Just iterating what you just said, that's what I was going to say, is you have the different levels identified in those tables, table 6 through table 9, and that's just starting there and measuring where you're performing as far as what's acceptable and not acceptable. I think we're all getting there, but starting there and starting point there and putting some numbers, whether it's a percentage or a number like a count, I think we'll all be converging into those values in the future.
Does that help the answer your question? It is a tricky topic, and we're all of us are trying to sort that out. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, the problem that I'm having is I've developed my performance metrics for each pipeline, and they're quantifiable and they're easy to understand, both on the technical and management side. But having to try to combine all those performance metrics and targets when the pipelines run really independent of each other and their characteristics are different, it's hard to put weight on some pipelines over the other, and so as a result, one pipeline could throw off the overall program management results if we were to be utilizing or weighing the results of one pipeline differently from the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess, if you're saying it's throwing, one system may be throwing off the overall metrics, but I guess in the same breath, you would want to see that impact to your program because there is something that's not right there. If there's an issue with one particular leak detection system, it should make your overall leak detection program KPIs, those KPIs should reflect that. Depending on the weight, now you're talking about weighting them, you could, I guess, contribute something to that effect to where one's weighted more than the other if that's the case in your system. But I think you do want to see that impact at the leak detection program level because that's where your management is involved, and if something needs to be improved on that particular system, then at least at the LDP level, you would see that difference in score, and that could bring attention to your upper management or your executive staff to consider that and provide more resources to maybe improve that system.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Donnie.
Also, hey, Rick.
You go ahead.
Doug Sauer here. One more thing I would just add to Donnie's response to that is I think that you probably could, it's good to just step back and think about why are we establishing KPIs and metrics and all that. What's all that in service to? And you can get as complicated and technical as you choose, but ultimately, if you look at what's it all in service to, it's for each operator to get better at detecting leaks, get better at shutting down quicker, minimizing, how to mitigate the consequences of spills. And so I think each operator, when you look at the overall program effectiveness, I think just using some management judgment is helpful to just to identify where do you feel like your program is on track, and where do you feel like, based upon individual pipeline KPIs, etc., where do you feel like more management focus needs to be applied? And I think it's important we just don't lose sight of that as we get, because the RP is very thorough, and we can kind of get buried in some of that sometimes. So I just throw that out there as a general comment for all of us to just sort of make sure you keep an eye on what the ultimate objective is.
And Doug, Rick Barlow here. Well, actually, I'm going to follow up with that with another question to you, Doug. Actually, maybe something you could comment on. Doug, the overall goal of API 1175 is to improve industry-wide leak detection. What should each company do specifically to ensure that they're making a step change in improvement? Do you have any suggestions?
Okay, yeah. So fair question. I guess along the same lines we were just discussing.
Right.
It's important that you have an overall improvement process in your plan, do, check, act processes, for example, in your leak detection program management. So we have an element 15 that addresses improvement process, and again, I think the value of that, it's really important that each operator spend some time on that and reflect on how your company's performance has been. Looking at your gaps, where do you feel like the highest risk is or the highest opportunities for improvement are, and whether it's training or your leak detection system design, robustness, etc. And then make sure that as an operator, you're driving continuous improvement throughout the company on the right things. Right? So it's all about managing that risk. So I think that element 15 is an important one in your program to really focus on the improvement process that you use.
Okay, great. Thank you, Doug. Maybe I'll go back to Sabrina and see if we have any more questions on the line. Anything there, Sabrina?
Thank you. And the next question will come from the line of David Martinez with Energy Transfer. Your line is now open.
Hi, everybody. I just want to expand on Carlos's question and comment and taking a look at the overall system application that we're putting in place here. So as we have individual pipes within our own company that differ and could affect our KPIs, when we roll this up to the larger leak detection KPI, leak detection program KPI, we have to keep in mind that each company is going to be different as well. And I think we should take those numbers kind of at a perspective with a grain of salt and say, okay, am I close to the area where we need to be? Because we have a little bit of flexibility how we're going to implement our testing procedures and how we're going to implement our KPIs and how we're going to implement our reporting. This is all a great step in the right direction. And I think the key thing here, the key takeaway is to keep internal records of your own processes and systems and go back over time and evaluate yourself, and then go back and look and say, okay, towards the industry, how are we doing towards the industry, and not let the industry overall drive how you should be implementing your testing procedures and your reporting procedures. I think that's very important, and I think that flexibility gives us that opportunity to look at the different assets that we have and how we're going to treat them, because everyone is going to be unique in its own way.
That's great. Very good point. Thanks for making that. And we'll go back to Sabrina to see if we have more questions. We have time for a few more questions. If they're out there, go ahead, Sabrina.
Thank you. And I'm showing that we have a follow-up question from Nikos Samalawani with Chevron. Your line is now open.
Hello, this is actually Tim Bach from Chevron Pipeline. I think maybe this is a question for Stuart. Do we have any experience with other programs API have implemented, maybe that we can leverage off of? Because I guess from my perspective, the goals or the KPIs or the measurable things of implementing this aren't really that tangible. And so have we done this before where we've tried to say, okay, we're going to implement this program, you know, you need to develop your KPIs, you need to show improvement, but really there's nothing measurable at this point that we can say, okay, we want to see X, and that means you're successful. Do we have experience with implementing something like that isn't quantifiable from the beginning?
So Rick, I can take this, and Tim, thanks for the question. I think that it's a very valid question, and that's where, from an API perspective, as kind of the industry standards development organization or an industry standards development organization, we are kind of transitioning from more of a writing the document and just kind of providing it to industry to use to more of a, hey, let's kind of somehow show that industry is implementing this. And so it's tough, though, because you kind of waver between all of our documents, or the majority of our documents, are more performance-based versus a prescriptive thing. So if it is prescriptive, then it's easy to say, oh, you had this many emissions, here's the number of emissions you're allowed, you either met it or you exceeded it or you were below it. Obviously, this document's not that prescriptive, and so and then also, too, to that vein, we want the industry to do it the way they see fit, right? So you as an operator at Chevron have kind of your mentality, have your thought process that you think this is the right way to execute this. Rick there at Enbridge probably has a different kind of thing around implementation. And so if you go back to Doug's slide where he talked about performance metrics, so he laid out 4 particular performance metrics. And that's kind of our first take at an industry level metric on how industry is doing in achieving implementation of 1175. So obviously not a lot of meat there, very kind of high level. I mean, I think You know, number 3, average leak size being reduced. Like obviously that's, you know, that's kind of, some people may say motherhood apple pie, but that is a tangible goal that we want to try to track and see that number go down from an average leak size. And so we're just kind of, and you know, to be honest, Tim, we are tiptoeing into this. There are other initiatives. You know, Pipeline SMS is another one that has this kind of performance-based drive, but as an industry, we're trying to track implementation and show, you know, external stakeholders that the industry is implementing. But they're struggling the same way you guys are. You know, they're trying to figure out how do we track something that's a performance-based guidance. And so, but similarly, they have some high-level metrics that they're tracking, and very similar to you guys, you know, spill performance, release performance, incident performance are a part of what they're tracking. So, yeah, I think it is a tough nut to crack, but at least we're starting with these 4, and then as we move along this journey, I think that, you know, we'll work with operators through the Cybernetics work group or through the 1175 implementation team to be sure if there are more things we can track to show progress, we do that. So I hope that answers your question, but happy to answer any follow-up.
No, I thank you for the answer, and I'll just throw a little comment in there. I understand the industry goal, but I think it's important that we have from an operator perspective, we have a definition of success for implementing this, and I'm not sure if we have what that definition is at this moment.
That's a good comment. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, excellent discussion. I'm going to go back to Sabrina, see if we have more questions online.
And I'm showing no further questions at this time.
Okay. We'll have to thank everybody for an active Q&A session. That's great. And what I would like to do is we'll now continue to the next steps part of the webinar, and this will be done by team member Robert Morgan of Chevron. Robert?
Good morning. So we've talked about some of the things we've done up to this point with the implementation team. So let's talk about what we have planned for the near future. So you go to the next slide, please. So the first thing we want you to do is be thinking about either updating or developing your gap assessment for the API and giving it to the API by March 1st of 2018. So we're trying to do 2 things. One is we're trying to get other operators to submit their data so that we get a better feel for where the industry is in implementation. The second thing is those of you that sent us the information last year, I think it's a chance to see how much progress you've made year on year. We are asking that you send the information that's shown to the right. It's just the scores for those elements. We're not asking for the working documents. I know there's some hesitancy from the operators to give specific data. But overall, that information will be consolidated and will show it as an industry. And I think we as a group can learn from it. Next slide, please. The results of that will be shared in the Cybernetics session that we have in April. The other thing we did is in August, we sat down as a team with the data mining team, as an implementation team, as we sat down with the data mining team and talked about the things that they were finding around leak detection. With the data that's presented in the PPTS, what are the things that we're learning that could help the implementation team? And one of their comments was that some of the challenges they were having getting meaningful information out of it. And so we worked with them and made some suggestions on what could be changed in the survey. And it was around 3 different areas. One was the details on the timing. A little bit more specific questions around when there was an indication of a leak, when a leak was confirmed, when was the leak isolated or stabilized. Those types of things become very important when you're looking at how the leak detection systems are performing. The other thing was what types of leak detection systems are on each specific pipeline that leaked. And so knowing what was there to provide that coverage, and then who and what detected the leak. whether it was a phone call from a hunter, whether it was your CPM, those types of things are starting to talk about the performance of the leak detection systems that are in place. So a little bit more detail around it, we feel like that would give us better insight to learn how we're performing as an industry. These changes were approved by the cybernetics team in October and sent to the DMT for adoption. And so those changes will be in place come January 1st, 2018. So we would appreciate your using that when it's appropriate. Next slide, please. So coming up, we've talked about two of the gaps up to this point. We think there's still room for discussion on where the industry is going and sharing of ideas. So we're trying to facilitate that as an implementation team. So at the Pipeline Conference and Cybernetics Symposium, it's in April. It's in St. Louis. We would encourage you to attend or send representatives for your company so we can learn together and share ideas. We have a 90-minute slot, which makes up 3 20-minute presentations. And of course, there's time for Q&A. We're still getting feedback from the industry on what topics would be appropriate. And then I would encourage you to make sure you get your gap assessment tool done by March so we can incorporate that in this conference. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over and talk about the API website. We have a number of tools developed by the development team for the API as well as we've developed. They're out on the API website. We would encourage you to go look at those. Specifically the gap assessment tool, which is a vehicle to kind of help you get jump-started, as well as the material you saw today. And it talks about several of the sections or elements in the RP itself and gives you some material to talk from. Not everybody wants to read 75 or 80 pages. And then the strategy document template that was discussed by Rick Bishop today is out there as well. So I would encourage you to take a look at it, see if it's something you can quickly adopt for your needs, and it may save you a lot of time and agony. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Stuart for closing.
All right, great. Thanks, Robert. So I appreciate, again, everybody's time this morning. I will say this, there is about maybe 10 minutes left, so if you do have one last question that maybe you thought of, Sabrina, if you could maybe check the queue and see, we'll open the lines one more time. But while anybody's dialing in or checking the queue for any last-minute questions, I'll say a few closing remarks. And that's just around, again, this is an important initiative for the industry. We're excited to, from an API standpoint, we're excited to develop these resources and work with great operators on this team to have them out for every one of you. And we do encourage you to take a look at that at the website, pipelinesms.org, and then there is a More Systems tab with the leak detection specific tab that has great resources and tools for you to use. So also, too, during some of the discussion, we thought about, and actually the gentleman from Chevron raised kind of lessons learned from other initiatives. So from an API standpoint, we've seen other initiatives. We've seen really good success with peer-to-peer sharing. So I think some of you may have already done some of this, but encourage you to visit with your peers, JV partners, business partners, whatever it may be, when it comes to the subject of leak detection. I think there's value in, sharing with each other, networking with each other on this particular topic. And so, while from an industry standpoint, API may not be able to share all of the details around gap assessments, there may be an opportunity for you as in a smaller setting, one-on-one with another peer operator to share some of those details and like Robert mentioned just a few minutes ago, learn together. So that's all I've got to say, but I did want to see if there was any last-minute questions.
And I'm showing no questions at this time.
Great, Sabrina. So as always, API is a resource that we want to be made available for you guys. So if you do think of something after the call, feel free to reach out to me, or we have an email specifically set up for this initiative. That's pipeline, the initials LDP, so pipeline LDP @api.org. feel free to send a note to that, and we'll be sure to get back to you. So, again, thanks for everyone's time, and have a great day.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in today's conference. This concludes your program. You may all disconnect. Everyone have a wonderful day.